Everyone has heard of Jack the Ripper, one of the oldest unsolved cases in history. There are even Ripperologists that spend all of their spare time studying the case of the murders of the disenfranchised women trying to secure a bite of food, a cot to sleep on, and feed their addiction to alcohol through sex work. But the case can't be reduced to what we think we know about the victims. Many of them were occasional sex workers. Others came from good families and even married and had kids. None of them deserved what happened to them. Throats slit, disemboweled, faces ruined. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Kelly, who was so destroyed by the Ripper's work that her remains didn't seem human. And then, as suddenly as the killing started, they stopped. Were the murders the work of a devoted and sophisticated killer or a crazed mental patient? This is the case of Jack the Ripper, and this is Outline of a Murder. This is Outline of a Murder. I am your host, Sherry, and with me is Mom.
Yes. Good morning. Afternoon.
Yes. No, it might be afternoon in some places.
Wherever you are, hello.
But this case, super excited. It's almost like the best for last kind of, but it's actually in the middle. And this is Jack the Ripper.
That's going to be very interesting.
The reason I'm excited is you went on the tour.
Uh-huh. I did.
So, over in England, I had no idea they have Jack the Ripper tours. And so I'm excited for you to interject and share some of the things that you've learned. This will probably be a 2-parter, maybe a 3, I'm not sure. We'll just see how far we get. But like we've been doing in our mid-season mini-series is we have drinks that they drank back in the day.
Yes, this mid-season is all, she has one, Sherry, all the way to the
1590. That'll be the last one. Elizabeth Bathory. And so I wanted to, and even the music for each podcast is period true. And even the music, I was able to find for the Bathory podcast, music from 1590, written back then, played on a harpsichord.
That's
and
crazy.
So even some of the podcast, the music is from that time, and I tweaked them a little bit. So,
great.
But also, what is true is we need to continue our tradition of Mom tasting drinks.
Yep.
Now, I did not think out well the drinks because, we did wine the last season, right?
Yes.
For you to test and grade.
Uh-huh.
And so my mind got stuck on, I guess, those types of drinks. And I didn't realize we could have had maybe some teas, some coffees maybe that they had. Instead, we're sitting here with a daiquiri at 9:26 a.m.
In this time, anyway. It might be later in your time.
Right. So, didn't think that out. But so far, you've liked the Pina Colada, which was the Sam Shepherd. You liked the French 75 better than the Manhattan for the Black Dahlia.
She made the drinks for the era.
Yes. I'd never made a cocktail, and the Manhattan was the first.
So this is for
1880.
1880? They had daiquiris?
They had daiquiri, or 1888. I'm sorry, they had daiquiris.
Really?
Yes. So let's try before we get into our Jack the Ripper.
That's good. Tastes like fruit punch. That'd be dangerous. Why is your glass littler?
I don't know.
Did you already drink all yours?
No. Oh, I didn't want as much. I'm not big on alcohol, actually. I'm not a big alcohol drinker.
That's good.
Although what's weird is I liked the Manhattan, which was stout. Like if you, and I apologize for us laughing hysterically. I was actually laughing hysterically. And we'll have videos of us doing our first drinks and pictures on our Instagram at Outline of a Murder and our Facebook. And please go to the website. And I would love if you guys give your thoughts and ideas, because a lot of these cases, some are unsolved. So the Black Dahlia is still unsolved. We did have like a bonus or a part 3 that goes into, who we think might have been a good suspect.
Or if you've researched any of the cases too and have any more knowledge we might need, or if there's a case you want us to do.
Well, and then on the lipstick killer, we both agreed that the crimes were totally separate, and we think that Hirons was innocent.
Yeah.
And then on Sam Shepard, I'm leaning toward the fact he was innocent, but I'm not sure Eberling did it. And then you obviously think he was innocent.
And I think he did do it.
Eberling?
Yes.
So on this one, Jack the Ripper, unless they have DNA, which I think they do, because there was a History Channel series where this guy thought that his relative was related to Jack the Ripper, and they did DNA to see. So they have DNA, I believe, from a scarf, which we'll get into.
Oh.
But that series did not continue, so I think that whole theory of him being related to Jack the Ripper was debunked, and they never finished the series.
Yeah.
It was very interesting, though.
Don't want to be humiliated on national TV.
And in that series, they try to connect H.H. Holmes. That's what it was. He was related to H.H. Holmes, and they were trying to prove that H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper were the same. It looks compelling. There was definitely, after the killings stopped in London, the killings started in Chicago, but they weren't slashers like Jack the Ripper. And then they were trying to see if they were one and the same guy. They even compared handwriting. They did all of this stuff. So it's definitely compelling as evidence, but the fact that it has not continued makes me think it was not proven. I personally do not think that Jack the Ripper was H.H. Holmes, which that's our next case, is H.H. Holmes. We'll get into.
They have a lot of theories on Jack the Ripper.
They do. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to correct, you said you didn't go on a tour.
No,
a cab driver.
We didn't go on the tour. The cab driver was giving us information on Jack the Ripper and the thoughts that they think still today in the London area.
Okay. Well, in 1888, we've got, like the famous Frank Lloyd Wright began working for a firm in Chicago. As far as, architecture, things like that. The National Geographic Society was incorporated. I'm not sure. There was like a huge blizzard in the Northeast. They called it the Blizzard of 1888. Tesla and the other guy, who was it? That did electricity. Good grief. The light bulb.
Edison.
Yeah. They were fighting over AC and DC. And then also, of course, we've got Gandhi, who traveled to London. And then we had the murders. Like, if you look at what was going on in 1888, the murders of Jack the Ripper, as you can see, are in that year. So it was a big deal.
Now, you usually do cost and such.
I couldn't find anything on that.
Could you not find anything?
Mm-mm. I'm sure it's like
pennies. What things cost? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Gas, too. Well, they didn't have gas, but... Well, yeah, they did.
No, they didn't have gasoline.
No, they didn't.
Nope. Okay.
It's not like I live back there.
Daiquiri already getting to you?
Right.
Okay. One thing I learned in my research that I did not know about was that there were suspected 6 to 11 victims. Now, they have a term called Ripperologists that I also didn't know existed. This is a term for those that they devote all their spare time to studying Jack the Ripper. And
like doctors or
no, they're just
regular.
They can be anywhere from an amateur sleuth to a criminal investigator,
professors, criminal investigators, right?
They have what they call the canonical. Is that how you say it? 5. That they're for sure the 5 are Jack the Ripper victims, and and they believe they were killed by the same man. Some have tried to say that Jack the Ripper and the murders didn't even exist. I didn't know that existed. I mean, there are people that think it was like a whole media newspaper thing to scare women out of prostitution.
Some didn't think the Holocaust was real.
Right.
So, you know.
We know it was. You have the crime scene videos and, all that. Or not videos. They didn't have video back then.
They didn't have video back then, but pictures.
I literally had a sip of the daiquiri, I promise. Okay. Now, also, that's obviously a dumb thing and it's an insult. But I was surprised to learn. Okay, let me back up. Some say that the women were not sex workers. That's not true. They were.
They were.
But I was surprised to learn where the women came from. A lot of them were divorced ladies with children. And so they did occasional sex work. That was not their profession.
Some of them.
Most of them.
Really?
Yes, I was shocked. And I guess I was shocked because, again, it's like the Black Dahlia. There were so many myths around her. There were just a lot of myths around these women, and they were not full-time sex workers.
I thought some
there
of them were.
There were one or two that did. But what was also interesting is many, if not all, I'll have to remember as I read my notes, were alcoholics.
I could see that.
Yeah, so
divorced, children.
Well, they were alcoholics, and that caused the divorce for some of them. And so it was very interesting. And I want to give you a website to go to right off the bat that's the authority to me on Jack the Ripper and all my research. And it's jack-the-ripper.org. This guy it would take you weeks to get through all of his stuff. But
I wonder if any were not part-time or prostitutes.
We'll get
like
into
an accident, sort of.
But he has like the events. He's got evidence.
Wow.
He has crime scene photos. He has videos. There's so many good things.
Is he one of the 5 that you were talking about that really investigated this? Remember, you said there's 5.
No, I said there's 5 victims for sure that are Jack the Ripper,
okay.
But they think there might be as many as 11. So you've got the 5 victims that are for sures, and then there's 6 others that might be, that people, suspect. So, yeah, he's got the history, the police hunt. It's so good.
Same MO on the others, too?
We'll get into that.
Okay.
You ask all these questions when we get started.
Because I don't even read these cases until Sherry presents them to me. So I have questions like our listeners probably do.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So any that are not answered, ask for sure. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through the victims from the Jack the Ripper website. Instead of me rewriting history,
right.
I just decided to grab his stuff. But I want to give honor to whom honor is due. This is not my research. This is from jack-the-ripper.org. Okay, so here we go. We're going to get to the victims right off the bat. So on the 31st of August, 1888, the horrifically mutilated body of a woman was found in a gateway in Bucks Row in Whitechapel. Now, when you were in England, did you go to the Whitechapel district?
We didn't.
Okay. Mm-mm. Later that day, she was identified as Mary Ann Nichols, better known to her family, friends, and acquaintances as Polly Nichols. She had separated from her husband and 5 children in 1888, and thereafter her life became a downward spiral, blighted by poverty and alcoholism. So let me see. I hope I have these named. I may not have these named. Oh, good grief. Okay, so this one is the first one, and Polly. And I thought I had a picture of her actually with her family. You can look it up. She was from a middle-class home, and she was not, she was raised in a good family. But there's a picture of her with her kids and husband.
Back then, too, women didn't work. Mm-hmm. And in a divorce, you could lose your kids.
Mm-hmm. Oh, she did.
And she was an alcoholic.
Yeah, she did. Her husband and their family got the kids.
So you fall in tough times.
She did. And back then, tough times were deadly for women, especially.
Yeah.
Even men and children, but women and children.
Women
they could
especially.
Die of starvation, etc. She had been separated from her husband and her 5 children in 1880, so this is 8 years later. And so by the beginning of August 1888, she found her way to the East End of London, where she resided at 2 Spitalfields common lodging houses which was called Wilmot's, and it was situated at 18 Thrall Street and the White House located on Flower and Dean. So the cost of a night's lodging at that time was 4 pence. But on the night of the 30th, she didn't have even this tiny amount.
Oh, no.
And so she was denied a night's, they call it a DOS, at Wilmot's Common Lodging House. Mary Nichols was known at the time as an unfortunate, or a woman who in the days when there was no welfare system to help those who had fallen on hard times, they might turn to casual prostitution in order to raise the money for a bed, a bite to eat, and drink to feed her addiction. So that's a drawing of her. That night, Mary was wearing a bonnet that none of the other residents of the lodging house had seen her with before. So I don't know if she purchased it, but since she was evidently intending to resort to prostitution in order to raise the money for her bed, she felt that this would be an irresistible draw to potential clients. And so she was escorted from the premises by the deputy lodging housekeeper. Polly laughed at him and said, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I have now."
Really? I wonder where she got it if she didn't even have the money
I don't know. Maybe she used her money to get it and then didn't have it for, I'm not sure, but she thought that would be a good advertising.
Right.
And that people would be drawn to her. So it sounds like,
or make her look more, sophisticated.
Yeah. And, the dress back then was amazing, even, if you were poor. But she looks like you would think any lady would look at that time. Mm-hmm. And so it makes me wonder if this was her first night of sex work, because it says she was wearing a bonnet, and since she was evidently intending to resort to prostitution in order to raise money for her bed, she thought it'd be an irresistible draw. And those are his words, not mine. I know that prostitution's not politically correct, which I really don't usually care about being politically correct, but that's what she was doing, and so it makes me think she just started.
Yeah, I agree. And she might have had the bonnet herself anyway.
Mm-hmm. From her old life.
Yeah.
Because she would have had all of that from her old life.
And look how nice she looks dressed.
It is 8 years later, so I'm not sure what she was doing between her divorce and now. Yeah,
8
she
years?
divorced in 1880, so I'm not sure what was going on. Now, at 2:30 on the morning of August 31st, a friend of hers by the name of Emily Holland met her by the shop at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. Mary was very drunk, and she boasted to Emily that she had made her lodging money 3 times over but had spent it. Concerned at Mary's drunken state, Emily tried to persuade her to come back to Wilmot's with her. Mary refused, and telling Emily that she must get her lodging money somehow, she stumbled off along Whitechapel Road, and that was the last time that Mary Nichols was seen alive.
Wow. Did you say how old she was?
No, because I'm not sure, but I'm assuming probably 30s. Because she had children by the time she divorced. If I can remember from the picture, I know for sure 2. I don't know if she had more kids.
I just was curious because Jack the Ripper, did he have a certain age?
They did all seem very similar in age, actually. Now, at 3:45, the body of a woman was found lying next to a gateway in Bucks Row, just off Whitechapel Road, and around 10 minutes walk from the corner where Mary had met Emily. So, like, literally 10 minutes later, or a 10-minute walk from where she saw Emily, her body is discovered. Her throat had been cut back to the spine.
Oh, my.
The woman being so savagely inflicted that, according to some newspaper reports, it had almost severed her head from her body.
Someone very strong.
Mm-hmm. And
wow.
Angry.
Yeah, very angry.
Now, this angry. To me, he may have been a sexual sadist, but to me, this is rage against women and a certain type of woman. And by that, I mean a sex worker. Like, obviously, he's picking up women that are sex workers. Within 45 minutes, she had been placed on a police ambulance, which in reality was nothing more than a wooden handcart, and had been taken to the mortuary of the nearby Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary. Here, Inspector Spratling of the Metropolitan Police's J Division arrived to take down a description of the, at the time, unknown victim, and he made a horrific discovery that in addition to the dreadful wound to the throat, a deep gash ran all the way along the woman's abdomen. She had been disemboweled.
And where was her? Was it on top of her, or did he just take it with him?
I don't know.
Wasn't it on top
there
or
was
by
just
the side of her?
I'm
her
not sure.
Insides, I believe.
There was just a gash and her throat was slit.
That's terrible.
And I believe, again, if we look at the mortuary photos, this is her right here.
Oh.
Okay. Then we have, later that day, they discovered that her name was Mary Ann Nichols, and her father, Edward Walker, was traced and taken to the mortuary where he formally identified the body as that of his daughter. With him was Mary's eldest son named Edward, who recognized her as his mother.
Oh.
An hour later, her estranged husband, William Nichols, arrived and went to the mortuary to view her body. Genuinely distressed by what he saw, he shook his head disbelievingly and whispered to her, "I forgive you as you are, what you have been to me." According to one newspaper, he emerged from the mortuary ashy white and sighed, "Well, there's no mistake about it. It has come to a sad end at last." So it sounds like she was drinking before they divorced.
It does.
And that may be why they divorced. So the funeral was a secret. They didn't want morbid curiosity seekers, taking, pictures or looking at her, etc. And so that was September 6, 1888. But a strange coincidence occurred. The ruse that was resorted to in order to get her body to the undertakers could be said to have included an element of precognition. For Mary Nichols' body was brought out of the mortuary back gate in Chapman's court from where it was taken to the undertaker's premises on Hanbury Street. 2 days later, the murderer would strike again and would murder Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street. So the same street.
That's pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just a few days later.
So this is Annie right here.
Is that her right there, too?
No, this is her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is Annie. Yeah, there's...
they sort of look alike.
They do. There's definitely a type.
To
dark
the first
hair,
one.
And their facial features are a little bit similar, except for this one to me. But now, I don't know. Let me see in my notes here if I have a drawing of Annie. No. Okay. So we'll get back to these. Okay, 15 or so minutes walk from the City of London Cemetery, you'll find Manor Park Cemetery, where a small memorial remembers Jack the Ripper's second victim, Annie Chapman, who was nicknamed Dark Annie. Like Mary Nichols, Annie had also seen a downward spiral due to alcoholism, and she had left her husband, John Chapman, and her children 7 years previously. John would send her periodic allowances until his death in 1886.
Wow.
Whereupon Annie supported herself by selling her own crochet work, as well as matches and flowers, and then she would supplement her earnings with casual prostitution. See, again, these were not women that was their career. They would do it when they needed to eat or to sleep.
It's reported most of them were prostitutes.
Yeah, I think
but
all
people,
of them...
you just assume it's all the time prostitute, not just to...
Yeah.
Occasionally. That's sad.
Which is the motivating factor for a lot of prostitutes even today. They need money, drugs, if they're on drugs, and a place to stay. Or they're just trying to provide for their children. Remember that lady that was murdered? That she was a high-end sex worker and no one knew?
I remember that, yeah. And a housewife. Nobody knew till after her death.
And she tried everything to support her family, except for sell her house. I'm like, why didn't you sell that huge house? You could have been set, So, anyway... So by September of 1888, she was living off and on at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street in Spitalfields. She appears to have enjoyed a cordial relationship with the other tenants, and the deputy keeper, Timothy Donovan, remembered her as being an inoffensive soul whose main weakness was a fondness for drink. However, following a fight with another resident at the lodging house in the last week of August, Annie had received a black eye and had been left bruised around the chest and head, and she was in a lot of pain.
Oh.
So she sounds like a really nice person, but when you're around that element, that I'm sure they had to be around due to poverty and crime, etc., she got hurt. At 5 p.m. on Saturday, September 7th, Annie met her friend Amelia Palmer in Dorset Street. Annie looked extremely unwell.
Was she a prostitute also?
I don't know, just as her friend. Huh. And then she said she was feeling too ill to do anything. Amelia met her again 10 minutes later, still standing in the same place, although Annie was by then trying desperately to rally her spirits. "It's no use giving way. I must pull myself together and get some money, or I shall have no lodgings," were the last words she said to Amelia. At 11:30 p.m. that night, Annie turned up at Crossingham's lodging house and asked Timothy Donovan if she could sit in the kitchen. Since he hadn't seen her for a few days, Donovan asked where she had been, and she said in the infirmary. She replied weakly. He allowed her to go to the kitchen, where she remained until the early hours of Saturday morning, the 8th of September, 1888. At 1:45 a.m., Donovan sent John Evans, the lodging house's night watchman, to collect the 4 pence for her bed from her. He found her a little tipsy and eating potatoes in the kitchen. When he asked her for the money, she replied wearily, "I haven't got it. I am weak and ill and have been in the infirmary." Annie then went to Donovan's office and implored him to allow her to stay a little longer, and he told her that if she couldn't pay, she couldn't stay.
Right.
And it sounds heartless, but, Mike used to manage rental properties. I know it sounds terrible, but you have to be that way because people will just keep staying and staying and staying.
And take advantage.
But he also was very cognizant of the type of people too that he was dealing with, because some, they were lying, like they had like 15 grandmothers that died, and all of that nonsense, but they could buy a brand new car and a TV, right?
Exactly.
But there were others that
really
they could get behind, and they would keep him updated. They get him money every time they had it, and blah blah. So he would have an exception, to his rule, right? Well, to me, if she was faithful in paying her money, that would probably be one that I would let stay that night, but probably not the next. If you're not going to get your money, right, I probably wouldn't keep going on and on.
I doubt back then, too, women were treated considered really like bad. A man was. And yes. I mean, they put him out on the street.
Especially a woman of, ill repute because she's, doing sex work.
Right.
I mean, if we thought the way the Sergeant Hansen thought of Black Dahlia was bad, you can imagine in 1888.
That was terrible.
Okay. Annie turned to leave, but then turning back, she told him to save her bed, adding, I shall not be long before I am in. I shall soon be back, and don't let the bed. John Evans then escorted her from the premises and watched her head off along Dorset Street, observing later that she appeared to be slightly tipsy as opposed to being drunk. At 5:30 that morning, Elizabeth Long saw her talking with a man outside number 29 in Hanbury Street, but since there was nothing suspicious about the couple, she continued on her way, hardly taking any notice. 30 minutes later, at 6 a.m., John Davis, an elderly resident of number 29, found her horrifically mutilated body lying between the steps and the fence in the backyard of the house. She was later identified by her younger brother, Fountain Smith. So in 30 minutes, she was killed. So the man outside number 29 obviously was a suspect.
Right. But nobody paid him any notice.
So that tells me a lot. He looked normal.
Yeah. Well, a lot of killers do.
Right. He didn't.
Because in your mind, you're thinking of a monster and you have a certain idea what they look like.
He obviously wasn't a vagrant.
It could be your neighbor.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't look, he didn't look like a killer, which they don't. That's the thing. That's
why some of them are such good.
Right.
Serial killers.
Right. Not all of them look like Richard Ramirez.
I mean, Ted Bundy.
He definitely looked evil.
Oh, he did.
If there was any legacy from the horrific and brutal murder of Annie Chapman, it was that the newspapers and through them the public at large began to pay attention to the plight of the poor women of the class from which Annie had come. It didn't go unnoticed that, like Mary Nichols before her, Annie had died for the sake of 4 pence that would have paid for her bed. The Daily Telegraph emphasized this point. Dark Annie's spirit still walks Whitechapel unavenged by justice. Her dreadful end has compelled 100,000 Londoners to reflect what it must have been like to have no home at all except the common kitchen of a low lodging house, to sit there sick and weak and bruised and wretched for lack of 4 pence with which to pay for the right of a doss, to be turned out after midnight to earn the requisite pence anywhere and anyhow, and in the course of earning it to come across your murderer and to caress your assassin, was a quote. Okay, the next one is the murder of Elizabeth Stride, which is right here in this top corner.
You know, they all sort of look close to the same age.
They do. Are you trying to figure out what their ages were?
No. I was curious as to what 4 pence was.
Okay.
So, you can keep talking. I don't want to read.
Okay. So, Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustaf's daughter in Sweden on the 27th of November, 1842. In 1866, she immigrated to England, arriving in London on the 7th of February that year. Now, I love this. That's why I like that website I told everybody about, because he knows a lot of detail about the victims and and again, I'm reading his stuff, okay, from his blog, so you know. But 3 years later, on the 7th of March, 1869, she married John Thomas Stride at the Church of St. Gillison the Fields, Holborn, and the newlyweds moved to the East End of London, where they opened a coffee shop in Crisp Street, Poplar, which I love the names.
I know.
They're so cool. Now, the couple separated around 1877, so 11 years before the murder started, after which Elizabeth began residing at various common lodging houses, and she also became involved with a man by the name of Michael Kidney. Over the next few years, she began drinking heavily, and she made numerous appearances before magistrates on charges of being drunk and disorderly. For the 6 years prior to her death, she had resided on and off at a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields. After a long absence, she had returned to the lodging house on the Tuesday before her death. Can you bring up her Elizabeth Stride?
Elizabeth Stride?
Yeah.
And by the way, back then a pence was a penny.
Okay.
Today it's a penny, but it's worth $1.29. A pence is worth today $1.29.
Okay, so about
penny,
4 pennies.
4 pennies for a lodging.
A place. Mm-hmm.
Who shall I look up?
Elizabeth Stride. I want to make sure we have the correct picture for her.
All right.
Because I think they're in order, but I want to make sure. Because I see 5 victims, but there's also 6. Oh, okay, so that's
not in order.
Her down here.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you look up Annie Chapman to make sure I have the correct... Why wouldn't you put them in order?
Oh, when he did it, you mean?
Yeah, in the picture. So, okay, that is Annie Chapman.
So on the website, that's Annie Chapman is right.
And then the first one, Mary, wasn't it? Yeah, Mary Ann Nichols. Can you look her up? Make sure we got the right. Yeah, and you can see that she's Swedish, too, because I was thinking, okay, yeah, so that one's right. So this one, I'm not sure why that's there, but look like her facial structure definitely looks like, different to me in that she does have the wider forehead, the bone structure above her eyes definitely looks more Swedish. I think she would have been very pretty. Like they're not,
Well, this isn't a flattering with the autopsy back in the 1800s.
But still, you can see even her.
She is pretty. The first 3
looks.
up there, they look a lot alike to me.
They do.
Which you can see on the website.
Which I wonder if that's actually her. Like maybe that's a drawing of Annie.
Well, maybe.
I'm not sure what whoever made that picture was doing. Okay. On Saturday, the 29th of September, 1888, she had spent the afternoon cleaning 2 rooms at the lodging house for which she was paid 6 pence by the deputy keeper. And by 6:30 p.m., she was enjoying a drink in the Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street. Returning to the lodging house, she dressed ready for a night out, and at 7:30, she left the lodging. There were several sightings of her over the course of the next 5 hours, and by midnight, she had found her way to Berners Street off Commercial Road. At 12:45 on the 30th of September, a man named Israel Schwartz saw her being attacked by a man in a gateway off Berners Street known as Dutfield's Yard. Schwartz, however, though he was a witness, thought he was witnessing a domestic argument, so he crossed over the road to avoid getting dragged into the quarrel.
Oh.
It's highly likely that Schwartz actually saw the early stages of her murder.
It's interesting he didn't stop.
A lot of people do that.
I know.
Yeah.
Doesn't make it right.
It doesn't. It's like they don't want to get involved or whatever. And I'm like, get involved. I've been told, hey, you probably shouldn't,
'Cause it's
say
scary.
certain things or do certain things. Well, I'm not going to let just people, get hurt. And so
I've been told that a lot lately.
her body was found in Dutfield's yard at 1 a.m. Louis Deemschitz, a steward of a club that sided onto Dutfield Yard, came down Burner Street with his pony and costermonger's barrow, I don't know what that means, and turned into the open gates of the yard. Immediately he did so, the pony shied and pulled left.
I think the burrow is the back inlet. It's like the open.
I wonder if they were picking up dung. That's what that is.
Oh, maybe so.
Costermongers. I don't know what that is. But anyway, so the pony pulls left. He looked into the darkness and saw a dark form on the ground. He tried to lift it with his whip but couldn't, so he jumped down and struck a match. It was wet and windy, and the match flickered on for just a few seconds, but it was sufficient time for him to see that it was a woman lying on the ground. For some reason, he thought the woman might be his wife and that she was drunk.
Oh, wow.
So he went into the club to get some help in lifting her up. However, he found his wife in the kitchen. So he got a candle, and he and several other members went out into the yard. And by the candle's light, they were able to see a pool of blood gathering beneath the woman. So it was growing.
Oh.
So she was just killed.
Yeah.
The police were sent for, and a doctor was summoned to pronounce life extinct. It was noted that although, as in the cases of the previous victims, a woman's throat had been cut, the rest of the body had not been mutilated. This led the police to deduce that the killer was interrupted when he turned into the yard, right? The body was removed to the nearest mortuary, which still stands, albeit as a ruin, in the nearby churchyard of St. George in the East, and here she was identified as Elizabeth Stride. Now, this is kind of bizarre. That's Catherine Eddowes up there in the top right corner. Yeah, that's who that is. Okay, so on the night of her burial, a lady went to the police station in Cardiff and made the bizarre claim that she had spoken with the spirit of Elizabeth Stride in the course of a seance, and the victim had identified her killer. The Somerset County Gazette reported on the extraordinary revelations a week later. An extraordinary statement bearing upon the Whitechapel tragedies was made to the Cardiff police on Saturday by a respectable-looking elderly woman who said she was a spiritualist, and in company with 5 other persons held a seance on Saturday night. They summoned the spirit of Elizabeth Stride, and after some delay, the spirit came and in answer to the question stated that the murderer was a middle-aged woman whose name she mentioned and who resided at a given number in Commercial Road or Street, Whitechapel, who belonged to a gang of 12.
Really?
Yeah,
I don't know. That sounds...
Yeah.
It says that also those 2 previous murders that were linked to the Whitechapel murders, they didn't think those were committed by Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, that's why I was saying it was a dispute.
Right.
Some believe it's up to 11.
Yeah, and some
but they know for sure the 5. I think there's for sure 6.
I think they're all connected.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And we'll get into the others. But
Okay.
I think for sure there were 6. I think there was a murder before the Marianne Nichols.
Oh, you do?
Mm-hmm. Okay, now the murder of Catherine Eddowes, so that's her in the top right corner. She was born in Wolverhampton on the 14th of April, 1842, although her family moved to London when she was a young girl.
Look how she's dressed, sort of. Looks like she's
She came from a good family.
A good family, yeah.
Good financial station. When we say that, we're not referring to value.
No.
Just at that time,
no.
She was a person that, grew up in a home that had good financial support, etc. But by the time she reached her mid-teens, both of her parents had died.
Oh.
And she and her siblings were separated, with Catherine returning to Wolverhampton to live with an aunt. Later, she met a former soldier by the name of Thomas Conway, and it was claimed that the couple were married, although no proof of this has been found. She has his initials, TC, tattooed in blue ink on her arm.
Well, that's rare back then.
Right.
A tattoo?
Yeah.
Wow.
The couple would have 3 children together, and they earned a meager income by selling what were known as chapbooks, which were cheap books sold on the streets by peddlers. By the end of the 1870s, the couple had moved to London and were living in Westminster. Catherine, however, had started drinking heavily.
Westminster, I have been.
Okay.
Very nice area.
Okay.
Real nice area.
And she was now an alcoholic. She had a fiery temperament And so the relationship became extremely tempestuous, and the couple repeatedly split up. So you can imagine what that looked like.
Right.
According to one of Catherine's sisters, Conway was an abusive partner, and Catherine also often sported black eyes as a result of domestic violence.
Wow.
In 1880, they separated altogether, and Catherine gravitated to the east end of London, where she moved into Cooney's Common lodging house at 55 Flower and Dean Street. And here in 1881, so 7 years before the murders, she met a man named John Kelly, who earned his living as a casual laborer at the local markets. The couple would live together as man and wife at the lodging house until Catherine's death in 1880. The deputy lodging housekeeper would later remember her fondly as a very jolly woman who was often singing.
Oh. That's sort of unheard of, just living with someone back then.
I know, and a tat. She was
And a
way ahead of her
tattoo,
time.
right.
You know what I'm saying? Now, each summer, Kathy and Kelly would head for Kent to go hop picking, which was a popular way for East Enders at the time to enjoy a break from the stifling and overcrowded streets of the district, while at the same time providing an opportunity to earn a little ready cash. In September 1888, they set off for their annual hop picking break, but as the hop yield was disappointingly low that year on account of an unusually wet summer, work was limited, and they decided to return to London, arriving back in the capital on the afternoon of Friday, September 28th. Kelly managed to earn 6 pence that day, and Catherine, having taken 2 pence for herself, handed him 4 pence, telling him to use it to get a bed at Cooney's that night. She told him that she would get a bed in the casual ward of the Shoe Lane workhouse. Although she did get a bed, there was some trouble at the workhouse, and she was asked to leave.
Oh.
She turned up at Cooney's at 8 a.m. on the Saturday morning. The couple went to a pawnbroker's shop on Church Street where they pawned Kelly's boots, using the money to buy breakfast.
Oh.
That afternoon, Catherine told Kelly that she was going to try and borrow some money from her daughter in Bermondsey, and at 2 p.m. they departed. According to Kelly's later testimony, he warned her about the Whitechapel murderer. But Catherine brushed aside his fears, saying, "Don't you fear for me, I'll take care of myself, and I shan't fall into his hands." It was never established how she spent the rest of the afternoon. She did not visit her daughter. She did acquire the money somehow, because at 8 p.m. that evening she was arrested for drunkenness on Aldgate High Street by Police Constable Robinson of the City of London Police.
Maybe prostitute. How else would she get it?
That's why I was thinking she maybe didn't want to go to her daughter.
Yeah.
She was taken to Bishopsgate Police Station, where she was locked in a cell to sober up, and she promptly fell fast asleep. By midnight, she was awake and was deemed sober enough for release by the city gaoler, P.C. George Hutt. Before leaving, she told him that her name was Mary Ann Kelly and gave her address at 6 Fashion Street. But we know it was Catherine Eddowes.
Right.
Hutt escorted her to the door of the police station, told her to close it on her way out. "All right, good night, old cock," was her reply as she headed out into the early morning, which is a bad idea.
Oh, very bad.
Don't release people, especially women, in the middle of the night. There's a case on True Crime Garage where they did that. It was a girl that, remember, she was acting unusual at a restaurant. Ate a meal, didn't pay. And she goes, and they release her in the middle of the night instead of waiting for the mom to get there, and she disappeared off the face of the earth.
And the mom had talked to him
and said, "Please don't release her. I'm coming." See, I'm getting all aggravated.
I remember that.
Gotta calm down. I want to get all tight in my shoulder and it start hurting again. At 1:35 a.m., 3 men, Joseph Lawede, Joseph Hyam Levy, and Harry Harris, are talking with a man at the Church Passage entrance into Mitre Square, located on the eastern fringe of the city of London. 10 minutes later, at 10:45, Police Constable Alfred Watkins walked his beat into Mitre Square and discovered her horrifically mutilated body lying in the darkness of the square's southwest corner. As with the previous victims, her throat had been cut and she had been disemboweled. But in addition, the killer had targeted her face.
Oh.
Cutting deep V's into her cheeks and eyelids. He also removed and had gone off with her uterus and left kidney. And as with the previous murders, he once again melted into the night. Since the 1990s, the cemetery authorities have maintained a simple memorial plaque to her. And as with the plaque to Mary Nichols on the opposite side of the path, people come here to remember her and to lay flowers and coins as close as it is now possible to get to the final resting place.
Why do you think that he took?
I have no idea. I'm sure there's like a
Cannibal
fetish type thing.
Or I don't know.
Now, Mary Kelly is the most unusual, or I guess you would say mysterious of them all. Let me bring up, I know this is a for sure sketch of her, and she looks like a very handsome woman.
She to me looks completely different than the rest of them.
Mm-hmm. So this is Mary Kelly, and
well dressed. Look at that.
This is supposedly his last victim, but again, there's dispute over the number. But she's also the most mysterious. So her name was Mary Jane Kelly. She's a victim that we know the least about. In fact, there's hardly anything we know about her prior to her arrival in the East End of London. What we do know is based on what she chose to reveal about her past to those she knew. And the veracity of what she did reveal is difficult to determine. Indeed, we don't even know for certain if her name was Mary Kelly.
Oh, really?
According to her boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, with whom she lived until shortly before her death, she had told him that she was born in Limerick, in Ireland, and that her father's name was John Kelly, and that she had 6 or 7 brothers and 1 sister. The family moved to Wales when she was a child, and when she was 16, she met and married a collier named Davis or Davies. 3 years later, her husband was killed in a mine explosion, and Mary moved to Cardiff to live with a female cousin who introduced her to prostitution. Mary moved to London around 1884, where she made the acquaintance of a French woman who ran a high-class brothel in Knightsbridge, in which establishment Mary began working. So this is one that we would consider a traditional, if there's such a thing, sex worker, where it was her, and I hate to use the word career, but that's what she did. Because really, again, if you're a woman without any means back in the day, what were you going to do?
There was really nothing because they didn't really hire women.
I mean, even like if you did sewing and cleaning and ironing, things like that. But it was just a pitiful, miserable, I'm sure, existence. She told Barnett that during this period in her life, she had dressed well, she had been driven about in a carriage, and for a time had led the life of a lady. She said, made several visits to France at that time and had accompanied a gentleman to Paris, but not liking it there, she returned back to London after just 2 weeks. From then on, she began using the continental version of her name and often referred to herself as Marie Jeanette Kelly. But thereafter, her life suffered a downward spiral, which saw her move to the East End of London, where she lodged with a Mrs. Bukie in the side thoroughfare off Ratcliffe Highway. Soon after her arrival, she established her landlady's assistance, or enlisted her landlady's assistance, in returning to the West End to retrieve a box which contained dresses of a costly description from the French lady. Mary had now started drinking heavily, and this led to a conflict between her and Mrs. Bukie, relations between them becoming so strained that Mary moved out and went to lodge at the home of Mrs. Mary McCarthy at 1 Breezers Hill, Pennington Street, St. George in the East. By 1886, she had moved into Cooley's Common Lodging House in Thrall Street, and it was while living here on Good Friday, April the 6th, 1887, she met Joseph Barnett, who worked as a porter at Billingsgate Fish Market. The two were soon living together, and by 1888, they were renting a tiny room at 13 Miller's Court from John McCarthy, who owned a chandler's shop just outside Miller Street. An article that appeared in the Daily Telegraph shortly after her death described her as having been of fair complexion with light hair, and she possessed rather attractive features. Those who knew Mary at around this time had been quite fond of her. According to one acquaintance, she was an excellent scholar.
Really?
And an artist of no mean degree, whilst her friend Maria Harvey described her as, quote, much superior to most persons in her position in life. So obviously educated, which that was rare for a woman.
Wonder if the information she gave was real.
I don't know.
I wonder where she really came from.
But if she was educated back in that day, she had to have come from a place of means where they were able to hire, governesses and tutors, because most women were not educated at that time, unless they were wealthy.
Unless you were wealthy, yes, you're right.
Remembering her in his memoirs, in 1937, retired police officer Walter Dew claimed that she had known her quite well by sight, and he told how he would often see her, quote, parading along Commercial Street between Flower and Dean Street in Aldgate, or along Whitechapel Road. She was, he continued, usually in the company of 2 or 3 of her kind, fairly neatly dressed and invariably wearing a clean white apron, but no hat. According to her landlord, John McCarthy, her only fault was that when in liquor, she could be very noisy, but otherwise she was a very quiet woman. She and Barnett appeared to live happily together until mid-1888, when he lost his market job and she returned to prostitution, which caused arguments between them. And during one heated exchange, a pane in the window by the door of their room had been broken. The precariousness of their finances had resulted in Mary falling behind with her rent, and by early November, she owed her landlord 29 shillings in rent.
Oh, no.
On October 30th, 1888, Joseph Barnett moved out, and although he and Mary remained on friendly terms and he would drop by to see her, the last time was around 7:30 on the evening of Thursday, November 8th, but he didn't stay long. Several people claimed to see her during the next 14 hours. One of them was George Hutchinson, an unemployed laborer who met her on Commercial Street at 2 a.m. on the 9th of November. She asked him if he would lend her 6pence, to which he replied that he couldn't as he had spent all of his money. Replying that she must go and find some money, she continued along Commercial Street where a man, coming from the opposite direction, tapped her on the shoulder and said something to her, whereupon they both started laughing.
Oh, boy.
The man put his arm around Mary, and they started walking back along Commercial Street, passing Hutchinson, who was standing under the lamp by the Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street. So you can see all of this is very close together, right? All these streets keep coming up, the same streets, the same places to stay. So the man had his head down with his hat over his eyes. Hutchinson stooped down and looked him in the face, whereupon the man gave him what Hutchinson would later describe as a stern look. Hutchinson followed them as they crossed into Dorset Street, and he watched them turn into Miller's Court. He waited outside the court for 45 minutes, by which time they hadn't reemerged, so he left the scene.
Wow. And the man was dressed well.
Mm-hmm. Dressed well. Mm-hmm. That's my straw, if you hear that noise. Not the most discreet.
Right.
Okay, so around 4 a.m., 2 of Mary's neighbors heard a faint cry of murder. But because such cries were frequent in the area, often the result of a drunken brawl, they ignored it. At 10:45, the morning of November 9th, her landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, Thomas Bower, round to Mary's room, telling him to try and get some rent. Okay, so the timeline is at 2 a.m., right? She, asked Hutchinson if he had any money.
Yeah.
He said no. Then a man comes, and they go into Miller's Court. So he waited for 45 minutes. So around this time, it's either 2:45 or closer to 3. At 4, 2 neighbors hear a faint cry of murder. So that's probably when she was killed, at 4 a.m. Then at 10:45, the assistant, Thomas, goes up to get some rent. Bower marched into Miller's Court and banged on the door. There was no reply. He tried to open it but found it was locked. He therefore went round to the broken window pane, reached in, pushed aside the shabby muslin curtain that covered it, and looked into the gloomy room. Moments later, an ashen-faced Bower burst back into McCarthy's shop on Dorset Street. "Governor, I knocked on the door and couldn't make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood." "Good God, you don't mean that," was McCarthy's reply, and the 2 men raced into Miller's Court, where McCarthy stooped down and looked through the broken pane of glass. McCarthy would later recall the horror of the scene that greeted him. "The sight we saw I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than a man. I had heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God that I never expected to see such a sight as this. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I never see such a sight like this again." So let me show you what freaked him out, which if you've done any research on Jack the Ripper, you've seen this. And that one, I wonder if the cutting on the face and stuff, if that was the last victim. But
do you think
that's her.
Wow.
Look at
But
that.
do you think that was by Jack the Ripper?
Yes, this was
Because
Jack
that's
the Ripper.
the first time he went into someone's home.
Which he always wanted to do, I'm sure.
Right.
He wanted more time. So, like, she's missing her middle part. And look, you can see the bone on her leg.
Wow.
Like, she's in her face. Look at her face. It looks like the skin was peeled off.
He needed more time to do what he wanted to do. He was escalating.
Yes.
Wow.
So the police were immediately sent, and one of the officers at the scene was the Walter Dew guy, who many years later would recall the horror. He said, on the bed was all that remained of the young woman, and there was little left of her, not much more than a skeleton. Her face was terribly scarred and mutilated. All this was horrifying enough, but the mental picture of that sight, which remains most vividly with me, is the poor woman's eyes. They were wide open and seemed to be staring straight at me with a look of terror. As news of another murder spread around the neighborhood, crowds of people converged at both ends of Dorset Street, and the police constables struggled to keep them at bay. More detectives and doctors were now arriving, but the police delayed entering the room as they believed they had been ordered to wait for bloodhounds to be brought to the scene and put on the scent of the killer. But just before 1:30, they received word that the order had been countermanded, and they asked John McCarthy to force open the door, which he did. What they saw and smelt that afternoon as they filled the tiny room would haunt many of those present for years afterwards, and the horror of the experience was succinctly expressed by one of the attending doctors, who later told a journalist that he had seen a great deal of dissecting rooms, but had never witnessed such a horrible sight as that inside 13 Miller's Court. The police and doctors spent the next few hours carrying out a detailed inspection of the crime scene. In addition, a photographer was brought in and the body was photographed as it lay on the bed. This horrific and haunting image still exists, and it's one of the earliest crime scene photos that we have.
That looks horrible.
Yeah, it's absolutely awful.
Then the worst.
I mean, you can see the wounding on her arms. You can see the blood on the door behind her.
Wow.
Her legs are splayed open, bent at the knees. And it looks like, I don't know what's on the table next to her, but it almost looks like body parts.
It does. It looks like an organ
but
of some
you
kind.
cannot recognize her as a human by her face. Like, her
The only
face
thing it
is
looks
destroyed.
like he didn't touch is the forehead and the eyes. That's horrible.
So,
And it's interesting, though, he needed that time. Wonder how long he was in there.
well, if they heard murder
at
4, and no one went in there until 10:45, I believe, he had hours. So once she yelled out murder, he probably waited a few moments to see if anyone was going to come to the door. And then once they didn't, he took his time doing exactly what he wanted to do. So just before 4 on the Sunday afternoon, a horse and a cart drew up on the opposite side of Dorset Street from Miller's Court, whereupon a large number of residents from the neighboring properties turned out to watch the remains of Mary Kelly being brought out in a long shelter coffin that was battered and scarred with constant use. She was then taken to the mortuary. Once the body had been removed, the windows of 13 Miller's Court were boarded up, the door was padlocked shut, and those who lived in the vicinity were left to come to terms with the horror that occurred. Few of them ever slept soundly in their beds at night.
I feel it had to be someone younger, someone handsome, for the women to laugh and just go.
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
and the strength of, like, the first victim, that cutting at the throat all the way to the spine almost.
And that looks like intestines.
It does, doesn't it? It does look like it.
And so, like, you can see intestines here on the bed.
That's just awful.
It is awful. So this was... Was that her? No, that was the lady from Sweden. Can you pull up Mary? I'd like to see if there's... Well, she was a handsome woman. We have a drawing, but I want to see which one is her. Mary Kelly. No, that's Mary Ann Nichols. This is Mary Kelly.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so that's the remainder from that fabulous website that I just wanted to go through the murders in depth because I had never, I'd never done a deep.
It's that one where she was dressed very well.
Yeah.
Looks like she came for money.
I'm just wondering who this is. Okay, we'll have to figure that out.
Yeah, who is that? Can you... it doesn't say?
Mm-mm.
Even.
Okay, Now,
let me look at something.
What's interesting from me from the start is the brazen attacks and quick work. I'm not sure he would need tons of time with Mary Kelly, but he definitely wanted more time. And I wondered, how long would it take him to slit the throat of his victim and take some organs and disembowel his victims? So from the murder of Catherine Eddowes, it seems the killer only needed 2 minutes or 10 minutes.
I wonder if he had a medical background.
I don't know. I don't think he would need one, though. So he only needed 10 minutes to slice a throat and disembowel a female.
I know some of the old, like I told you, the cab driver was talking to us. Some of the old theories were that he had to have medical, he had to be strong, young.
I think he had to be strong.
They thought at one time it was a Prince Victor.
Right. Well, we'll get into that. I don't think it was.
No, I don't either, because he wasn't even there in that area. But some have said they had seen a carriage from the royal family, but
again, eyewitness
but rumors,
reports,
just rumors and rumors.
So he only needed 10 minutes, and then after studying this case for this podcast,
is that her?
I don't know. It might be. So after studying this case, the killer obviously had intense rage to almost decapitate the first victim. He also had probably a deep, deep desire or even a fetish to mutilate and dissect the bodies as much as possible. It makes sense that eventually he would want time to do his work. And I put that in air quotes.
And he didn't have time on the street, but he did in the apartment.
Yes. So I'm thinking he was probably a sexual sadist again, and his knife was part of that, but I'm not sure. So what I want to do is, now that we've got the victims lined up, I want to save the remainder of the story for part 2.
Okay, that'd be great.
Outline of a Murder is a Mr. Joseph production. What do you think, Joseph?